Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, you're stepping into a side of ancient China that your history teacher either didn't know or definitely didn't want to explain. Picture yourself walking through the West Market of Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty, shoulder to shoulder with merchants shouting in a dozen dialects. The air is thick with the sweet burn of incense, the earthy scent of dried roots, and if you're paying attention, the faint metallic tang of powdered minerals being scooped into paper packets. On one table, a jar labeled Heavenly Elixir. On the next, a pile of ginseng roots that look disturbingly like tiny, screaming men. And you? You've just been handed a small porcelain cup, steam curling into your face. You have no idea whether it will cure your cough, make you hallucinate celestial dragons, or stop your heart before nightfall. The truth is, in ancient China, medicine and recreational substance weren't two separate shelves in the apothecary. They were often the same jar. If it could change your body, alter your mood, or open a door to the spirit world, someone had tried it, and someone had written about it in neat brushstrokes, as if a note could save the next curious soul from disaster. So before we unpack the philosophies, the trade routes, and the alchemists who gambled with lives in the name of longevity, let's make a deal. If you're ready to discover remedies so strange they'd make a modern doctor call in sick, hit that like button now. Tonight, you'll see what happens when desperation meets creativity in a world where your local healer might prescribe anything from powdered rhinoceros horn to fermented urine. Picture this. You're standing in the bustling marketplace of Chang'an, the glittering capital of Tang Dynasty China, circa 750 CE. The air is thick with incense, spice dust, and something that might charitably be called optimism. Your head is pounding from last night's rice wine, your stomach is doing acrobatics that would impress a circus performer, and your local physician has just handed you a small clay pot filled with what looks suspiciously like tree bark, mixed with questionable powder. Welcome to ancient Chinese medicine, where the line between cure and adventure was refreshingly thin. You're probably wondering how we got here. How did one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations develop a medical system that sounds like it was designed by someone who took creativity as a personal challenge? The answer lies in thousands of years of trial, error, and an impressive willingness to experiment on anything that moved, grew, or could be ground into powder. And once they found something worth keeping, they didn't just toss it in a pot and hope for the best. The preparation methods were equally sophisticated. Chinese practitioners had mastered techniques for extracting, concentrating, and preserving active compounds that wouldn't look out of place in a modern laboratory. They used distillation, fermentation, crystallization, and even early forms of chemical synthesis to create medicines that were far more potent than simple herbal teas. Take the process for creating what they called prepared aconite. Aconite, derived from monkshood plants, contains some of the most potent cardiotoxins known to humanity. In its raw form, it's basically plant-based poison that can stop your heart in minutes. But Chinese alchemists developed elaborate processing techniques involving repeated boiling, steaming, and treatment with other substances that could reduce its toxicity while preserving its therapeutic effects. The result was a medicine that could treat severe arthritis, chronic fatigue, and circulatory problems with remarkable effectiveness. Modern pharmaceutical research has confirmed that properly processed aconite does indeed have powerful anti-inflammatory and circulatory effects. The ancient Chinese practitioners had figured out how to tame one of nature's most dangerous plants and turn it into medicine. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of ancient Chinese pharmacology. Animal-derived medicines weren't just supplements or folk remedies. They were serious therapeutic interventions based on the principle of like treats, like if you needed strength, you consumed parts from strong animals. If you needed longevity, you looked to animals known for their long lifespans. Rhinoceros horn wasn't just a status symbol. Chinese physicians believed its dense, never-rotting structure could transfer those properties to human tissue. Tiger bone was prescribed for joint problems because tigers were seen as creatures of incredible physical power. Deer antler, which regenerates annually, was used to treat conditions related to growth and vitality. The preparation of these substances was as complex as any mineral alchemy. Animal parts were dried, ground, fermented, and combined with plant and mineral ingredients according to precise formulations that had been refined over centuries. This wasn't casual folk medicine. These were expensive, carefully prepared pharmaceuticals that only the wealthy could afford. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of ancient Chinese medicine was their exploration of what we might call psychoactive therapy. Chinese physicians recognized that many medical conditions had psychological components, and they weren't shy about using substances that could directly affect consciousness and mood. Cannabis, which they called ma, was extensively documented in Chinese medical texts going back over 3,000 years. But they weren't using it the way you might expect. Chinese practitioners had identified specific preparations and dosages for different therapeutic goals. They used cannabis seeds for digestive problems, cannabis flowers for pain relief, and cannabis resin for what they described as spiritual disorders. The preparation methods were remarkably sophisticated. They created cannabis wines, cannabis oils, and even cannabis incense that could be burned for inhalation therapy. Different strains were cultivated for different medical purposes, and practitioners understood that the plant's effects varied dramatically depending on how it was grown, harvested, and processed. More intriguingly, Chinese alchemists had discovered that combining cannabis with certain minerals and other plant substances could create preparations with effects that went far beyond simple intoxication. They described states of enhanced perception, spiritual insight, and therapeutic experiences that sound remarkably similar to what modern researchers are discovering about psychedelic-assisted therapy. But cannabis was just one entry in their extensive catalog of consciousness-altering medicines. Chinese texts describe the use of various mushrooms, plant extracts, and mineral preparations that could induce altered states for therapeutic purposes. They understood that sometimes healing required more than just treating physical symptoms. Sometimes it required changing the patient's entire relationship with their illness and their life. The philosophical framework behind these practices was sophisticated in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to appreciate. Chinese practitioners believed that many illnesses originated from imbalances in the patient's energy system, emotional state, or spiritual condition. Physical medicines were just one tool in a comprehensive approach that might also include meditation, dietary changes, exercise, and yes, carefully controlled experiences with consciousness-altering substances. This holistic approach led to some fascinating discoveries about drug interactions and synergistic effects. Chinese physicians became masters at creating complex formulations, where multiple active substances worked together to produce effects that none could achieve alone. They discovered that certain herb combinations could enhance the therapeutic effects of minerals while reducing their toxicity. They found that adding specific plant extracts to alcohol-based tinctures could dramatically alter their pharmacological properties. These weren't accidental discoveries. Chinese medical texts contain detailed instructions for testing new combinations, adjusting dosages based on patient response, and modifying formulations to address side effects. They were conducting systematic pharmaceutical research using methods that wouldn't be formalized in Western medicine for another 1,000 years. The most fascinating part wasn't what they discovered, but how they discovered it. You have to understand, ancient Chinese medical research was a deadly serious business where the stakes were literally life and death. Imperial physicians who failed to cure their patients didn't just lose their jobs. They lost their heads. This created a peculiar dynamic where medical innovation was driven by both scientific curiosity and sheer terror. The testing process was methodical in ways that would make modern ethics committees break out in cold sweats. New formulations were first tested on condemned criminals, then on willing volunteers from lower social classes who were compensated with money or reduced sentences. Only after extensive human trials would a new medicine be considered safe enough for wealthy patients or imperial family members. But here's where it gets interesting. Chinese physicians had developed something that wouldn't appear in Western medicine until the 20th century, the controlled clinical trial. They understood that individual patient responses could vary dramatically, so they tested new treatments on groups of people with similar symptoms and carefully documented the results. They tracked not just whether patients recovered, but how quickly, with what side effects, and under what circumstances the treatments failed. This systematic approach led to some remarkable discoveries about dosage and timing. Chinese medical texts contain precise instructions for adjusting medicine strength based on patient age, body weight, season of the year, and even time of day. They had figured out that the human body's response to drugs follows predictable patterns that could be mapped and exploited for better therapeutic outcomes. Take their understanding of what they called drug timing. Chinese physicians recognized that certain medicines were more effective when taken at specific times relative to meals, sleep cycles, or seasonal changes. They discovered that some substances worked better on an empty stomach, others required food to prevent digestive upset, and still others needed to be taken just before sleep to maximize their effects. This wasn't just empirical observation. Chinese medical theory provided a framework for understanding why timing mattered. They believed that the body's energy systems followed predictable cycles throughout the day and year. Medicine taken when the relevant energy channels were most active would be more effective than the same dose taken at random times. Modern chronopharmacology, the study of how drug effectiveness varies with biological timing, has confirmed many of these ancient insights. Chinese practitioners had discovered principles about circadian rhythms and metabolic cycles that Western science wouldn't formally recognize for another 1,000 years. But perhaps their most impressive achievement was in the field of what we might call combination therapy. Chinese physicians rarely prescribed single-ingredient medicines. Instead, they created complex formulations that might contain dozens of different substances, each chosen to enhance, balance, or modify the effects of the others. These weren't random mixtures thrown together by guesswork. Chinese medical texts describe precise ratios and preparation, methods that had been refined through centuries of experimentation. They understood that certain combinations could produce therapeutic effects that were greater than the sum of their parts, while other combinations could neutralize dangerous side effects without reducing therapeutic benefits. Consider their approach to pain management. Rather than relying on a single powerful analgesic, Chinese physicians would combine several mild pain-relieving substances with herbs that reduced inflammation, minerals that improved circulation, and sometimes even small amounts of psychoactive plants that could alter the patient's perception of pain. The result was comprehensive pain relief with fewer side effects than any single ingredient could provide. The preparation of these complex formulations was an art form that required years of training to master. Apprentice physicians spent decades learning not just which substances to combine, but how to process each ingredient to maximize its therapeutic potential. Some herbs needed to be harvested at specific lunar phases. Others required elaborate fermentation processes, and minerals often went through multiple stages of purification and chemical modification. The tools and techniques they developed were surprisingly sophisticated. Chinese alchemists had invented distillation apparatus, crystallization chambers, and chemical furnaces that could maintain precise temperatures for days or weeks at a time. They understood concepts like pH balance, chemical extraction, and even rudimentary forms of chromatography for separating and purifying active compounds. But what really set Chinese medicine apart was their approach to what modern medicine calls personalized therapy. Chinese physicians didn't believe in one-size-fits-all treatments. They understood that each patient was unique, with individual constitutional strengths and weaknesses that required customized therapeutic approaches. The diagnostic process was elaborate and thorough. Chinese physicians would examine not just the patient's obvious symptoms, but their pulse patterns, tongue appearance, skin color, voice quality, body odor, and even their emotional tendencies. This comprehensive assessment allowed them to create individualized treatment plans that addressed the patient's specific imbalances rather than just their disease symptoms. This personalized approach extended to drug selection and dosage. The same condition might be treated with completely different medicines depending on the patient's constitution. A robust young man with acute pneumonia might receive powerful stimulating herbs and mineral supplements, while an elderly woman with the same infection might get gentle, nourishing formulations designed to support her body's natural healing processes without overwhelming her system. The sophistication of this individualized approach becomes clear when you look at their treatment of what they called difficult diseases. These were chronic, complex conditions that didn't respond to standard treatments. Chinese physicians developed elaborate protocols for systematically testing different therapeutic approaches until they found combinations that worked for specific patients. They kept detailed records of these experimental treatments, creating what amounted to the world's first database of personalized medicine. Successful formulations were documented and shared among practitioners, creating a growing body of knowledge about how to treat unusual or resistant conditions. This collaborative approach to medical knowledge was revolutionary for its time. While European medicine was still dominated by rigid adherence to ancient authorities like Galen, Chinese physicians were constantly testing, modifying, and improving their treatments based on real-world results. Medical knowledge was seen as something dynamic and evolving rather than fixed and unchangeable. The communication networks they developed for sharing medical information were remarkably efficient. Chinese physicians maintained correspondence with colleagues across vast distances, exchanging information about new treatments, unusual cases, and experimental techniques. Imperial medical colleges served as central repositories for medical knowledge, collecting and cataloging successful treatments from throughout the empire. This systematic approach to knowledge sharing led to some fascinating developments in what we might call evidence-based medicine. Chinese medical texts from the Song dynasty contain detailed statistical analyses of treatment outcomes, comparing the effectiveness of different approaches for specific conditions. They tracked success rates, side effect frequencies, and long-term patient outcomes with a precision that rivals modern clinical research. But the real genius of Chinese medicine lay in their understanding of what modern medicine calls the placebo effect. Chinese physicians recognized that a patient's mental and emotional state could dramatically influence their response to treatment. They developed elaborate tools and psychological techniques designed to enhance the therapeutic effects of their medicines. The preparation and administration of medicines became theatrical performances, designed to inspire confidence and hope in patients. Physicians wore special robes, used ceremonial tools, and performed ritualized procedures that convinced patients they were receiving powerful, almost magical treatments. This wasn't deception. Chinese medical theory held that the patient's belief in the treatment was itself a therapeutic factor that needed to be cultivated and strengthened. They understood that healing involved more than just correcting biochemical imbalances. True recovery required addressing the patient's emotional state, social relationships, spiritual condition, and overall life circumstances. Medicine was just one component of a comprehensive healing process that might also include counseling, lifestyle modifications, meditation practices, and sometimes even changes to the patient's living situation or social relationships. This holistic approach led to some remarkable insights about the connection between mind and body. Chinese physicians documented cases where emotional trauma had caused physical illness, where spiritual practices had accelerated healing, and where social isolation had made patients resistant to otherwise effective treatments. They developed therapeutic techniques that addressed these psychological and social factors as seriously as they treated physical symptoms. The integration of psychological and pharmacological treatment was particularly sophisticated in their approach to what they called spirit disorders. These were conditions that modern medicine might classify as depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues. Chinese physicians understood that these conditions often required treatments that could directly affect consciousness and mood. They developed specialized formulations that combined consciousness-altering plants with herbs that stabilized mood and minerals that were believed to strengthen the spirit. These weren't recreational drugs disguised as medicine. They were carefully calibrated therapeutic interventions designed to help patients break out of destructive psychological patterns and develop healthier ways of thinking and feeling. The administration of these consciousness-altering medicines was carefully controlled and supervised. Patients would be prepared through fasting, meditation, and counseling before receiving treatment. The drug experience itself would be guided by trained practitioners who could help patients interpret and integrate their altered state experiences. Follow-up treatments would help patients maintain the psychological gains they had achieved during their therapeutic sessions. This approach to psychoactive medicine was remarkably similar to what modern researchers are discovering about the therapeutic potential of psychedelic compounds. Chinese practitioners had figured out that certain altered states of consciousness could provide powerful healing experiences, but only when properly prepared for and skillfully guided. The sophistication of their understanding becomes even more apparent when you examine their approach to treating addiction and dependency. Chinese physicians recognized that some of their most powerful medicines could become problematic if used inappropriately. They developed detailed protocols for preventing and treating what they called medicine dependence. Their approach to addiction treatment was comprehensive and humane. Rather than simply stopping the problematic substance, they would gradually reduce dosages while providing supportive treatments that addressed the underlying conditions that had led to dependency in the first place. They understood that addiction was often a symptom of deeper physical, emotional, or spiritual imbalances that needed to be corrected for recovery to be successful. The withdrawal protocols they developed were remarkably effective. They used combinations of herbs that could ease withdrawal symptoms, minerals that supported detoxification, and sometimes other psychoactive substances that could help patients transition away from their problematic drugs without experiencing severe discomfort. But perhaps most importantly, they recognized that successful addiction treatment required addressing the social and environmental factors that contributed to dependency. They would often recommend changes to the patient's living situation, social relationships, and daily routines as part of a comprehensive recovery program. This understanding of addiction as a complex, multifaceted condition that required comprehensive treatment was centuries ahead of its time. Western medicine wouldn't develop similarly sophisticated approaches to addiction treatment until the late 20th century. The legacy of ancient Chinese pharmacology extends far beyond their specific discoveries about individual drugs and treatments. They had developed a systematic approach to medical research, a sophisticated understanding of personalized medicine, and an integrated model of healing that addressed physical, psychological, and social factors simultaneously. Modern pharmaceutical research is finally beginning to appreciate the sophistication of their methods. Contemporary studies of traditional Chinese medicines are revealing that many of their complex formulations do indeed have therapeutic effects that are greater than the sum of their individual components. The synergistic interactions they had discovered through centuries of experimentation are being confirmed and explained by modern biochemistry and pharmacology. But perhaps their most important contribution was philosophical rather than technical. Chinese medicine demonstrated that healing is an art as much as a science, requiring not just technical knowledge, but also wisdom, compassion, and a deep understanding of human nature. They showed that effective medicine must address the whole person, not just their disease symptoms. Their most dangerous experiments, however, weren't happening in imperial laboratories or medical colleges. They were taking place in the private workshops of what you might call ancient China's underground chemists. These were the practitioners who pushed beyond the boundaries of acceptable medicine into territory that would make modern drug enforcement agencies break out in cold sweats. You have to understand, the line between medicine and poison in ancient China wasn't just blurry. It was practically non-existent. The same substances that could cure you in small doses could kill you in larger ones, and the practitioners who specialized in these dangerous medicines occupied a shadowy world between healer and assassin. Take the case of the 5-stone powder, a concoction that became the cocaine of ancient Chinese high society. This wasn't some folk remedy passed down through generations. It was a precisely formulated synthetic drug that required advanced chemical knowledge to produce safely, if such a thing was even possible. The base ingredients read like a medieval chemistry set gone wrong. Realgar, an arsenic sulfide mineral that glowed orange red in lamplight. Cinnabar, that mercury compound we discussed earlier. Magnetite, an iron oxide that practitioners believed could align the body's internal compass. Sulfur, which they thought could purify corrupt blood. And finally, stalactite powder, because apparently even cave formations weren't safe from ancient pharmaceutical experimentation. But here's where it gets fascinating in the most disturbing way possible. The preparation process wasn't random mixing. Chinese alchemists had developed specific heating and cooling cycles that would partially break down these toxic minerals into forms that could be absorbed by the human digestive system without immediately killing the user. They had essentially created a slow release poison delivery system that could provide euphoric effects for months before the inevitable toxic accumulation became fatal. The effects were everything you'd expect from a cocktail of heavy metals and sulfur compounds. Users reported intense euphoria, heightened sensory perception, feelings of invincibility, and a peculiar side effect where they couldn't tolerate wearing heavy clothing because their skin became hypersensitive to touch. Wealthy addicts would walk around in the middle of winter wearing nothing but silk robes, convinced they had transcended normal human limitations. The social impact was devastating. Entire noble families became addicted to 5-stone powder, spending fortunes on increasingly pure preparations while slowly poisoning themselves to death. The Tang Dynasty court became notorious for its powder-addled officials, making increasingly bizarre policy decisions, while their hair fell out and their skin took on an unhealthy metallic sheen. But the really twisted part, Chinese physicians knew exactly what was happening. Medical texts from the period contain detailed descriptions of powder addiction, including withdrawal symptoms, long-term health effects, and recommended treatments for overdose. They understood the biochemistry well enough to document it, but the demand was so lucrative that production continued anyway. The detoxification process they developed tells you everything you need to know about how serious the addiction problem had become. Withdrawal from 5-stone powder could take years and required a gradual substitution protocol using less toxic mineral preparations. Physicians would slowly replace the arsenic and mercury compounds with iron and copper-based alternatives, then gradually reduce the dosages while providing supportive treatments for the inevitable organ damage. Some patients never fully recovered. Chinese medical texts describe a condition they called stone poison syndrome, where former users would experience tremors, memory problems, and periodic episodes of what sounds suspiciously like heavy metal poisoning for the rest of their lives. The treatment protocols for these chronic cases read like early attempts at managing what we would now recognize as severe neurological damage. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of ancient Chinese pharmacology. The experimental use of human subjects wasn't limited to condemned criminals or desperate volunteers. Chinese alchemists had developed an entire industry around what they euphemistically called medicine testing, using people who had no choice in the matter. The imperial medical system maintained facilities that were essentially human laboratories, where new formulations could be tested under controlled conditions. These weren't hospitals in any sense we would recognize. They were research institutions where the primary goal was advancing pharmaceutical knowledge, regardless of the cost in human suffering. The subjects weren't just criminals either. Chinese law allowed physicians to requisition test subjects from among slaves, debtors, and political prisoners. The testing protocols were methodical and thorough, tracking not just immediate effects, but long-term outcomes over months or years. Some subjects were deliberately kept alive for extended periods to study chronic effects, while others were systematically dosed to determine lethal limits. The records from these experiments are simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. Chinese physicians documented precise dose-response relationships for dozens of toxic substances, mapped out the progression of various poisoning syndromes, and developed detailed protocols for managing overdoses and toxic reactions. This was systematic human experimentation on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. The knowledge gained from these experiments wasn't just used for medical purposes. Chinese alchemists had essentially created the world's first systematic database of poisons and their effects. This information was highly valued by imperial intelligence services, professional assassins, and anyone else who needed to eliminate enemies without leaving obvious traces. The sophistication of their toxicological knowledge becomes apparent when you examine their approach to what they called slow death preparations. These were substances designed to cause gradual deterioration over months or years, mimicking natural diseases or age-related decline. The victim would slowly weaken and die without any obvious signs of poisoning, making these preparations perfect for political assassinations or inheritance disputes. The preparation methods were incredibly complex, involving multiple stages of processing to create substances that would accumulate in specific organs or body systems. Some preparations targeted the nervous system, causing progressive paralysis that could be mistaken for stroke. Others focused on the digestive system, creating wasting diseases that looked like natural illness. Still others attacked the circulatory system, causing heart problems that appeared to be age-related deterioration. The most sophisticated preparations were designed to be activated by specific triggers. Chinese alchemists had discovered ways to create substances that remained relatively harmless until the victim consumed certain foods or was exposed to particular environmental conditions. These conditional poisons allowed assassins to administer the toxic preparation days or weeks before the intended death, making it virtually impossible to establish a connection between the poisoning and the victim's eventual demise. The antidote knowledge was equally sophisticated. Chinese physicians had developed treatments for most of their poison preparations, but this information was closely guarded and rarely shared outside of elite medical circles. The ability to both poison and cure made these practitioners incredibly powerful and dangerous figures in Chinese society. This dual knowledge of toxicology and antidotes led to some fascinating developments in what we might call pharmaceutical diplomacy. Chinese officials would sometimes deliberately expose foreign ambassadors to mild doses of exotic poisons during state banquets, then provide the antidotes as a demonstration of Chinese medical superiority and a subtle threat about what could happen to enemies of the empire. The psychological warfare applications were equally sophisticated. Chinese intelligence services developed preparations that could cause temporary madness, memory loss, or personality changes without permanent physical damage. These substances could be used to discredit political enemies or extract information from prisoners without leaving evidence of torture. But perhaps the most ingenious application was in what they called pharmaceutical loyalty testing. Chinese officials would periodically dose their subordinates with substances that required regular antidote treatments. This created a chemical dependency that ensured absolute loyalty, since any attempted betrayal would result in a slow, unpleasant death as the accumulated toxins took effect. The administration of these substances was often disguised as routine medical treatments or ceremonial rituals. Officials would be told they were receiving health-promoting tonics or participating in traditional purification ceremonies, unaware that they were actually being inducted into a system of chemical control that would bind them to their superiors for life. The social implications of this pharmaceutical control system were profound. Chinese political culture became permeated with an atmosphere of chemical paranoia, where nobody could be entirely sure what substances they were consuming or what effects they might have. This created a climate of fear and dependency that helped maintain imperial authority, but also led to widespread social dysfunction. The economic impact was equally significant. The demand for exotic poisons and their antidotes created entire industries devoted to finding, processing, and trading in toxic substances. Chinese merchants established trade networks that stretched across Asia, bringing back rare minerals, plants, and animal parts that could be transformed into pharmaceutical weapons. Some of these substances were so valuable that they became diplomatic gifts exchanged between nations. Chinese emperors would present foreign rulers with rare medicines that were actually elaborate poison delivery systems, while receiving similar gifts that required careful analysis by imperial toxicologists before they could be safely used. The arms race aspect of this pharmaceutical diplomacy led to increasingly sophisticated detection methods. Chinese alchemists developed tests for dozens of different poisons, using everything from color-changing chemicals to trained animals that could detect toxic substances in food and drink. The imperial food tasting protocols became elaborate ceremonies involving multiple layers of testing and verification. But the real breakthrough came when Chinese physicians realized they could use their toxicological knowledge for legitimate medical purposes. Many of their most effective medicines were actually controlled doses of substances that would be lethal in larger quantities. By carefully mapping out the therapeutic windows for various toxic compounds, they created treatments that were far more powerful than anything available through conventional plant-based medicine. The concept of therapeutic poisoning became a cornerstone of advanced Chinese medicine. Physicians would deliberately administer small doses of toxic substances to stimulate the body's natural defense mechanisms or to target specific disease processes. This approach required incredible precision and deep understanding of both the poison's effects and the patient's individual physiology. The training required to master these techniques was extensive and dangerous. Apprentice physicians would spend years learning to recognize different toxic substances, understand their effects, and calculate appropriate dosages. Many apprentices became accidental test subjects themselves, developing chronic health problems from exposure to the substances they were learning to use. The most advanced practitioners developed what amounted to chemical immunity to many common poisons through gradual exposure and careful antidote management. These master toxicologists could handle substances that would be immediately fatal to normal people, making them both invaluable as healers and terrifying as potential enemies. The knowledge they accumulated was carefully guarded and passed down through secretive lineages that operated more like criminal organizations than medical schools. The transmission of this knowledge often involved elaborate initiation rituals, where new students would be deliberately poisoned and then cured as a demonstration of their master's power and their own commitment to the dangerous path they were choosing. The psychological effects of this training were profound. Practitioners who specialized in toxic medicines developed a peculiar relationship with death and suffering that set them apart from conventional physicians. They understood viscerally that the line between healing and harming was razor thin, and this knowledge gave them a perspective on human mortality that was both profound and deeply unsettling. This brings us to perhaps the most controversial aspect of ancient Chinese pharmacology, their use of human-derived medicines. You thought animal parts were disturbing? Chinese alchemists had discovered that certain human tissues and fluids possessed unique therapeutic properties that couldn't be replicated using any other substances. The theoretical framework behind these practices was based on the principle of cures taken to its logical extreme. If you needed to treat human illness, what could be more appropriate than using medicines derived from human sources? The logic was seductive, even if the practical implications were horrifying. Human placenta, known as purple river cart, became one of the most prized medicines in the Chinese pharmacopoeia. Rich in hormones and growth factors, it was believed to restore vitality, enhance fertility, and even reverse aging. The preparation methods were elaborate, involving careful cleaning, drying, and grinding of fresh placentas obtained from healthy births. But placentas were just the beginning. Chinese medical texts describe the therapeutic use of human hair, fingernails, teeth, blood, urine, and even more disturbing substances that are better left undetailed. Each substance was believed to carry specific therapeutic properties related to its function in the living body. The sourcing of these materials created a complex underground economy where desperate people could sell parts of their bodies for medical use. Hair and fingernails were relatively benign, but the demand for fresh blood and other bodily fluids led to practices that would make modern ethicists reach for their strongest sedatives. The most valuable human-derived medicines came from specific types of people. The blood of young virgins was prized for treating women's reproductive disorders. The hair of elderly scholars was believed to enhance memory and intellectual capacity. The teeth of warriors were ground into powders for treating cowardice and fear. The preparation of these substances required specialized knowledge and equipment. Human blood had to be processed immediately to prevent coagulation, while other materials required specific preservation techniques to maintain their therapeutic properties. The practitioners who specialized in these medicines operated in the shadows of Chinese society, providing services that were simultaneously essential and deeply taboo. The effectiveness of these treatments is difficult to evaluate from a modern perspective. Some human-derived medicines, like placenta preparations, do contain active compounds that could have therapeutic effects. Others were probably pure placebo, working only because patients believed they were receiving powerful medicines derived from human essence. But the psychological impact was undeniable. Patients who consumed human-derived medicines often reported profound changes in their condition, whether due to actual pharmacological effects or the intense psychological impact of crossing such fundamental taboos. The treatment experience itself became a transformative ritual that could alter the patient's entire relationship with their illness and their mortality. The social implications of these practices were complex and disturbing. The demand for human-derived medicines created incentives for exploitation and abuse that Chinese authorities struggled to control. Laws were passed regulating the trade in human body parts, but enforcement was sporadic and corruption was widespread. The most disturbing cases involved the systematic harvesting of materials from executed criminals. Chinese law eventually required that certain body parts be removed from executed prisoners for medical use, creating a direct connection between the justice system and the pharmaceutical industry that persisted for centuries. This brings us to the darker side of Chinese medical research, the systematic study of death itself. Chinese physicians had developed detailed protocols for observing and documenting the dying process, partly for legitimate medical research, but also to identify the optimal timing for harvesting various body parts and fluids. The knowledge gained from these observations was incorporated into their understanding of life and disease. Chinese medical theory included sophisticated concepts about the relationship between life force and physical matter that were informed by direct observation of what happened when that life force departed from the body. But the strangest chapter in ancient Chinese pharmacology wasn't written in medical colleges or imperial laboratories. It was carved into the daily lives of ordinary people who had turned self-medication into an art form that would make modern, recreational users look like cautious beginners. You wake up in a typical Song Dynasty household around 1100 CE, and your morning routine includes decisions that would baffle a contemporary physician. Do you start the day with fermented Mare's milk infused with hemp seeds for energy? Perhaps a pinch of processed opium poppy mixed with ginseng tea to take the edge off last night's rice wine? Or maybe you're feeling adventurous and reach for that bottle of morning clarity drops your neighbor swears by, the one that contains a mysterious blend of mushroom extracts and mineral powders that makes colors seem brighter and conversations more interesting. This wasn't addiction in any sense we'd recognize today. Chinese society had developed a sophisticated culture of daily pharmaceutical enhancement that blurred the lines between medicine, recreation, and spiritual practice. People weren't trying to escape reality. They were trying to optimize it. The neighborhood drug dealer wasn't some shadowy criminal lurking in back alleys. He was the respected local apothecary who knew your family's medical history going back 3 generations and could recommend the perfect combination of substances to help you sleep better, work more efficiently, or navigate social situations with enhanced confidence and charm. The selection process was remarkably personalized. Chinese pharmacists had developed detailed classification systems for different personality types and constitutional patterns. If you were naturally anxious, you'd receive calming formulations based on cooling herbs and sedating minerals. If you tended toward lethargy, you'd get stimulating preparations featuring warming spices and energizing animal products. But here's where it gets fascinating from a social perspective. These weren't individual decisions made in isolation. Entire communities would coordinate their pharmaceutical routines to create shared experiences and synchronized social rhythms. Villages would collectively prepare for harvest season by consuming energy-enhancing formulations, or collectively wind down for winter with sedating preparations that helped everyone adjust to shorter days and longer nights. The preparation rituals became community bonding experiences. Neighbors would gather to process herbs, ferment medicinal wines, and share knowledge about new formulations they'd discovered or inherited from elderly relatives. These weren't drug parties in any modern sense. They were sophisticated pharmaceutical workshops where people pooled their knowledge and resources to create better medicines for everyone involved. The quality control was impressive. Community groups would test new formulations on volunteers, carefully documenting effects and side effects before allowing widespread use. They understood that pharmaceutical experimentation was inherently dangerous and developed elaborate safety protocols to minimize risks while maximizing benefits. The seasonal patterns were particularly sophisticated. Chinese communities had mapped out annual cycles of pharmaceutical use that aligned with agricultural rhythms, weather patterns, and social obligations. Spring called for detoxifying preparations to cleanse the body after winter's heavy foods and limited activity. Summer required cooling formulations to help people cope with heat and humidity. Autumn brought preparations designed to strengthen the body for the coming cold season, while winter featured warming medicines that helped maintain energy and mood during the darkest months. These seasonal protocols weren't just folk wisdom passed down through generations. They were based on careful observation of how different substances affected people under varying environmental and social conditions. Chinese communities had essentially created localized pharmaceutical research programs that refined their practices over centuries of collective experimentation. The social stratification was complex and revealing. Different social classes used different categories of substances, not just because of cost differences, but because of fundamentally different lifestyle requirements and social expectations. Farmers needed medicines that enhanced physical endurance and helped them cope with manual labor. Scholars required preparations that improved mental clarity and helped them stay alert during long study sessions. Merchants wanted formulations that enhanced their ability to negotiate deals and remember complex financial arrangements. The preparation methods reflected these different needs. Working-class formulations tended to be simple, robust preparations that could be made in large batches and consumed without elaborate rituals. Upper-class medicines were more refined, often requiring complex preparation procedures and ceremonial consumption practices that emphasized their exclusivity and sophistication. But the most intriguing aspect was how these pharmaceutical cultures handled what we might call enhancement ethics. Chinese communities had developed elaborate social norms around appropriate and inappropriate uses of consciousness-altering substances. It was perfectly acceptable to use stimulating preparations to work more efficiently or calming medicines to sleep better. But using substances to gain unfair advantages in competitions or to manipulate other people's emotions was considered deeply unethical. The enforcement of these norms was community-based rather than legal. People who abused pharmaceutical enhancement would find themselves socially ostracized, excluded from the cooperative preparation groups, and unable to access the higher quality formulations that required group coordination to produce. This social pressure was remarkably effective at preventing abuse while maintaining access for legitimate therapeutic and enhancement purposes. The integration with daily work life was seamless. Different occupations had developed their own pharmaceutical traditions tailored to specific job requirements. Silk weavers used eye drops that enhanced their ability to see fine details. Porcelain painters consumed preparations that steadied their hands and improved their color perception. Musicians took formulations that enhanced their hearing and helped them maintain rhythm during long performances. The most specialized preparations were developed for what Chinese society called dangerous professions. Soldiers received formulations designed to enhance courage and reduce sensitivity to pain. Miners used substances that helped them work in low-oxygen environments and detect dangerous gases. Sailors consumed preparations that reduced seasickness and helped them maintain balance during storms. These occupational pharmaceuticals weren't just performance enhancers. They were comprehensive life support systems that helped people survive and thrive in challenging work environments. The formulations often included protective elements designed to counteract the negative health effects of specific occupations, creating an early form of industrial medicine. The knowledge transmission systems were remarkably sophisticated. Each profession maintained its own pharmaceutical traditions, passed down through apprenticeship programs that combined practical training with extensive education about substance preparation and use. Master craftsmen were expected to understand not just their trade skills, but also the pharmaceutical knowledge necessary to maintain peak performance throughout their careers. The regional variations were equally fascinating. Different parts of China developed their own pharmaceutical cultures based on locally available materials and specific environmental challenges. Mountain communities specialized in high-altitude adaptation formulations. Coastal regions developed preparations for dealing with humidity and marine environments. Desert areas created substances for surviving extreme heat and water scarcity. These regional differences led to an active pharmaceutical trade network where communities would exchange their specialized knowledge and preparations. Annual markets became opportunities for pharmaceutical practitioners to share innovations, compare techniques, and acquire substances that weren't available in their home regions. The quality standards varied dramatically depending on the intended use and target population. Military formulations were tested under extreme conditions to ensure reliability during combat situations. Civilian preparations went through more gradual testing protocols that prioritized safety over maximum effectiveness. Elite formulations for wealthy users underwent the most rigorous testing, often taking years to perfect before being approved for regular use. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how these pharmaceutical cultures handled adverse effects and addiction potential. Chinese communities had developed sophisticated early warning systems that could identify problematic usage patterns before they became serious health threats. Community elders would monitor younger members for signs of dependency or abuse and intervene with counseling, alternative treatments, or temporary restrictions on access to potentially problematic substances. The intervention protocols were comprehensive and compassionate. Rather than simply cutting off access to substances, communities would provide alternative formulations that could ease withdrawal symptoms while addressing the underlying conditions that had led to problematic use. They understood that most pharmaceutical abuse was actually self-medication for untreated physical or emotional problems. The success rates for these community-based intervention programs were remarkably high. Chinese historical records suggest that most people who developed problematic relationships with pharmaceutical substances were able to recover and return to normal community participation within a few months of intervention. The key was addressing the root causes rather than just the symptoms of abuse. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of ancient Chinese pharmaceutical culture, their approach to what modern society might call recreational drug use. Chinese communities made careful distinctions between substances used for medical purposes, performance enhancement, spiritual practice, and pure enjoyment. Each category had its own social norms, preparation methods, and usage protocols. Recreational use wasn't condemned or criminalized, but it was carefully regulated through social pressure and community oversight. People were expected to demonstrate that they could handle recreational substances responsibly before being allowed access to the more potent preparations. This created a natural progression system that prevented inexperienced users from accessing substances that could be dangerous without proper preparation and supervision. The social settings for recreational use were structured and supervised. Communities would organize seasonal festivals and celebrations where recreational substances could be consumed in safe, controlled environments with experienced guides and medical practitioners standing by to handle any problems that arose. These weren't wild parties, but carefully managed social experiences designed to maximize enjoyment while minimizing risks. The integration of recreational and spiritual use was particularly sophisticated. Chinese communities understood that certain altered states of consciousness could provide valuable insights into personal problems, social relationships, and life direction. They developed elaborate protocols for using consciousness-altering substances as tools for self-reflection and spiritual development. These spiritual pharmaceutical practices weren't separate from daily life, but integrated into the broader community support systems. People going through difficult life transitions might be prescribed specific consciousness-altering experiences designed to help them gain new perspectives on their situations. The preparation would include counseling, meditation training, and social support to ensure that the altered state experience translated into practical life improvements. The most advanced practitioners could guide others through these consciousness-altering experiences, serving as combination therapist, spiritual advisor, and medical supervisor. These guides underwent extensive training that combined pharmaceutical knowledge, psychological insight, and spiritual wisdom. They were among the most respected members of their communities and were consulted on everything from personal problems to major life decisions. The training programs for these guides were intensive and selective. Candidates had to demonstrate not just knowledge of substances and their effects, but also psychological stability, ethical integrity, and genuine concern for others' well-being. The training process often took years and included extensive personal experience with the substances they would later administer to others. But the real sophistication of Chinese pharmaceutical culture becomes apparent when you examine their approach to what we might call pharmaceutical innovation. Rather than leaving drug development to isolated specialists, Chinese communities created collaborative research networks where ordinary users could contribute to the development and refinement of new formulations. The innovation process was democratic and inclusive. Community members who discovered interesting effects from combining different substances would share their findings with local pharmaceutical practitioners, who would then conduct more systematic testing to determine whether the discoveries had broader applications. Successful innovations would be gradually adopted by neighboring communities and eventually incorporated into the broader pharmaceutical knowledge base. This crowdsourced approach to drug development led to rapid innovation and continuous improvement in pharmaceutical effectiveness and safety. Communities were constantly refining their formulations based on feedback from users, adjusting dosages based on seasonal variations, and developing new preparations to address emerging health challenges or social needs. The documentation systems were remarkably thorough. Community pharmaceutical practitioners maintained detailed records of formulation changes, usage patterns, and outcome data that allowed them to track the long-term effects of their innovations. These records became valuable resources for other communities and contributed to the gradual improvement of pharmaceutical knowledge across Chinese society. The economic implications were significant. Pharmaceutical innovation became a source of community, wealth, and prestige. Communities that developed particularly effective formulations could trade their knowledge for resources, establish relationships with distant regions, and attract skilled practitioners who wanted to learn their techniques. But the most important economic effect was the creation of sustainable pharmaceutical production, systems that could support entire communities. Rather than depending on expensive imports or rare materials, Chinese communities learned to cultivate and process pharmaceutical substances using local resources and traditional agricultural techniques. The agricultural integration was seamless. Many pharmaceutical plants were grown alongside food crops, creating diversified farming systems that provided both nutrition and medicine. Farmers became sophisticated pharmaceutical producers who understood not just how to grow medicinal plants, but also how to process them into effective formulations. This agricultural pharmaceutical integration had profound effects on Chinese society's resilience and self-sufficiency. Communities that might otherwise have been vulnerable to external disruptions could maintain their health and productivity using locally produced medicines. This pharmaceutical independence became a crucial factor in China's ability to maintain political and cultural continuity. Despite centuries of warfare and social upheaval, the knowledge preservation systems were equally impressive. Chinese communities developed elaborate methods for storing and transmitting pharmaceutical knowledge that ensured continuity across generations. Master practitioners would train multiple apprentices to prevent knowledge from being lost if key individuals died unexpectedly. Written records were supplemented with practical demonstrations and hands-on training that ensured knowledge remained accurate and usable. The most valuable knowledge was often encoded in poetry, songs, and stories that could be memorized and transmitted orally, even when written records were unavailable. These mnemonic systems allowed pharmaceutical knowledge to survive periods of political chaos and social disruption that destroyed other forms of cultural information. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of ancient Chinese pharmaceutical culture was its integration with what we might call preventive medicine. Rather than waiting for illness to develop and then treating it with powerful interventions, Chinese communities developed pharmaceutical protocols designed to maintain health and prevent disease from occurring in the first place. These preventive protocols were based on careful observation of how different substances affected long-term health outcomes. Communities would track the health patterns of people who used different pharmaceutical regimens and gradually refine their recommendations based on real-world evidence of what worked best for maintaining vitality and longevity. The preventive approach extended beyond individual health to community well-being. Chinese pharmaceutical practitioners understood that many health problems were actually symptoms of broader social and environmental issues. They developed formulations designed to help communities cope with pollution, food shortages, seasonal climate variations, and social stress. The most sophisticated preventive programs were designed to address what Chinese practitioners called lifestyle diseases. They recognized that certain patterns of work, diet, and social interaction could lead to predictable health problems and developed pharmaceutical interventions designed to counteract these negative effects before they became serious medical conditions. These lifestyle pharmaceutical protocols were remarkably advanced for their time. They included formulations for dealing with stress, maintaining mental clarity under pressure, supporting digestive health despite poor food quality, and maintaining physical fitness despite sedentary work requirements. The practitioners who developed these protocols had essentially created an early form of lifestyle medicine that wouldn't reappear in Western culture until the late 20th century. The social organization required to support these complex pharmaceutical systems was equally impressive. Chinese communities created elaborate networks of cooperation that allowed them to share resources, knowledge, and expertise across wide geographic areas. These networks functioned as early forms of healthcare systems that provided pharmaceutical services to entire populations rather than just wealthy individuals. The network maintenance required constant communication and coordination between communities. Practitioners would travel regularly between settlements to share knowledge, provide specialized services, and coordinate responses to epidemic diseases or other health emergencies. This created a dynamic, adaptive healthcare system that could respond quickly to changing conditions and emerging threats. The most remarkable aspect of these networks was their resilience and adaptability. Even when political systems collapsed or military conflicts disrupted normal social organization, the pharmaceutical networks often continued to function, providing essential healthcare services that helped communities survive and recover from disasters. This pharmaceutical infrastructure became one of the foundational elements of Chinese civilization, providing the health and vitality that allowed Chinese society to flourish despite the challenges of pre-modern life. The knowledge and practices developed through centuries of pharmaceutical experimentation created a cultural foundation that supported population growth, technological innovation, and social development on a scale that wouldn't be matched by other civilizations for many centuries. But the really twisted part wasn't happening in royal palaces or medical colleges. It was unfolding in the dusty corners of ordinary Chinese households, where your average farmer had figured out how to turn his evening rice wine into something that would make modern chemists reach for their hazmat suits. You stumble home after another back-breaking day in the fields, your joints screaming from bent-over labor that started before sunrise. Your wife greets you with a knowing smile and a small clay cup filled with liquid that glows amber in the flickering candlelight. This isn't your grandfather's rice wine. This is what happens when centuries of agricultural wisdom collide with pharmaceutical desperation and a complete disregard for what future generations might call safety regulations. The transformation began innocently enough. Chinese farmers had always fermented their grain surpluses into alcohol, partly for preservation, and partly because sometimes you need something stronger than tea to face another season of unpredictable weather and imperial tax collectors. But somewhere along the way, they discovered that adding certain plants to the fermentation process could create effects that went far beyond simple intoxication. The experimentation was methodical and surprisingly scientific. Farming communities would designate specific individuals to test different combinations of herbs and fermentation techniques, carefully documenting which additions produced useful effects and which ones produced unfortunate trips to the ancestral realm. This wasn't random mixing. It was systematic research conducted by people who understood that their survival might depend on finding better ways to manage pain, exhaustion, and the grinding stress of premodern agricultural life. The results varied dramatically depending on what grew in your particular region. Northern communities developed wheat-based, fermentations enhanced with wild mushrooms that provided sustained energy for long winter months. Southern rice farmers created preparations using tropical plants that could help workers function in extreme heat and humidity. Mountain communities specialized in high-altitude formulations that addressed the unique challenges of farming in thin air and harsh weather. But the real innovation came when farmers started combining their fermented medicines with processed minerals from local sources. Rural communities had discovered that certain clays, salts, and metal-bearing rocks could be processed into powders that dramatically enhanced the effects of their plant-based preparations. This wasn't accidental contamination. Chinese farmers had developed sophisticated techniques for extracting and purifying mineral compounds using nothing more than fire, water, and an impressive amount of patience. The processing methods they developed would have impressed professional chemists. They learned to control fermentation temperatures by burying vessels at specific depths underground. They discovered that certain types of wood could be burned to create ashes with specific chemical properties that could alter the final product's effects. They even figured out how to use seasonal temperature variations to create controlled chemical reactions that wouldn't have been possible with primitive heating methods alone. The quality control was surprisingly rigorous. Rural communities developed elaborate testing protocols that could identify contaminated batches, determine optimal potency levels, and ensure consistency across different production cycles. They understood that pharmaceutical preparation was inherently dangerous and created safety systems that prevented most serious accidents while still allowing for continued experimentation and improvement. The social organization around these rural pharmaceutical operations was complex and fascinating. Villages would often specialize in producing specific types of preparations, then trade with neighboring communities to access the full range of substances needed for comprehensive health care. This created regional networks of pharmaceutical exchange that operated parallel to normal agricultural trade systems. The seasonal patterns were particularly sophisticated. Rural communities had mapped out annual cycles of pharmaceutical production that aligned with agricultural rhythms and resource availability. Spring brought preparations focused on supporting the intense labor of planting season. Summer formulations were designed to help workers cope with extreme heat and long daylight hours. Autumn medicines supported the physical demands of harvest, while winter preparations helped people maintain health and morale during the coldest, darkest months. But the most remarkable aspect was how these rural pharmaceutical systems handled what we might call quality assurance. Village elders would maintain detailed knowledge about which practitioners could be trusted to produce safe, effective preparations and which ones had developed reputations for dangerous experimentation or poor quality control. This informal regulatory system was remarkably effective at preventing widespread poisoning incidents while still allowing for innovation and improvement. The knowledge transmission systems were equally impressive. Master practitioners would train multiple apprentices from different families to ensure that valuable pharmaceutical knowledge wouldn't be lost if key individuals died unexpectedly. The training process often took years and included extensive hands-on experience with every aspect of production, from plant cultivation through final preparation and quality testing. The most valuable knowledge was often encoded in agricultural songs and seasonal rituals that could be memorized and transmitted orally, even when written records weren't available. These mnemonic systems allowed pharmaceutical knowledge to survive periods of political chaos and social disruption that destroyed other forms of technical information. This brings us to one of the most disturbing chapters in rural Chinese pharmaceutical history: the development of what contemporary sources called desperation medicines. These were preparations created specifically for use during famines, plagues, and other disasters, when normal medical resources weren't available and people were willing to try anything that might help them survive. The ingredients for these desperation medicines read like a catalog of everything you should never consume. Tree bark that had been processed to remove the most toxic compounds, but still retained enough active substances to suppress hunger pangs. Fermented animal waste that had been aged and purified until it could provide some nutritional value during starvation periods. Even processed leather and bone meal that had been chemically treated to make it digestible. But here's what makes it fascinating, rather than simply horrifying. These weren't random combinations thrown together by desperate people. Chinese rural communities had systematically researched and developed these emergency preparations during times of abundance, testing them carefully and documenting their effects so they would be ready when disaster struck. The preparation methods were elaborate and time-consuming, often requiring months of processing to transform inedible raw materials into substances that could actually support human life. Communities would prepare these desperation medicines in advance and store them in special facilities designed to preserve their potency over long periods. The effectiveness was variable, but sometimes remarkable. Historical records describe communities that survived extended famines using nothing but these processed emergency foods, maintaining enough health and strength to resume normal agricultural activities once conditions improved. The pharmaceutical knowledge that made this possible represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about human survival under extreme conditions. The psychological effects were equally important. Having access to these desperation medicines provided communities with confidence that they could survive even the worst disasters. This psychological resilience became a crucial factor in Chinese society's ability to recover from the periodic catastrophes that plagued pre-modern agricultural civilizations. But the most controversial aspect of rural pharmaceutical culture was their approach to what modern medicine might call performance enhancement for survival. Chinese farming communities had developed extensive knowledge about substances that could help people work longer, endure more hardship, and maintain functionality under conditions that would normally be incapacitating. These weren't recreational drugs or casual performance enhancers. They were survival tools designed to help people function during harvest seasons when 14-hour workdays were normal, during military conscription when physical demands could be overwhelming, or during emergency situations when superhuman effort was required to prevent community disaster. The substances themselves were often combinations of stimulants, pain suppressors, and endurance enhancers that could keep people functional for days or weeks beyond their normal limits. The preparation methods were carefully calibrated to provide sustained effects without the dramatic crashes that would make users unable to function once the substances wore off. The usage protocols were strict and carefully supervised. These performance-enhancing preparations weren't distributed casually but reserved for genuine emergencies when community survival was at stake. Village leaders would make collective decisions about when conditions justified their use and would carefully monitor users to prevent abuse or dangerous overexertion. The long-term health effects were well understood and carefully managed. Rural communities had developed comprehensive recovery protocols for people who had used these extreme performance enhancers, including supportive treatments that helped restore normal physical function and prevent permanent damage from the temporary superhuman efforts they had enabled. The social implications were profound. Chinese rural communities had essentially created pharmaceutical support systems that could help them survive challenges that would have destroyed societies without access to such sophisticated enhancement technologies. This pharmaceutical resilience became one of the hidden foundations of Chinese civilization's remarkable durability. The knowledge required to maintain these systems was extensive and constantly evolving. Rural pharmaceutical practitioners had to understand not just the substances themselves, but also human physiology, agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and social dynamics that could affect when and how their preparations should be used. The training programs were intensive and selective. Not everyone could become a pharmaceutical practitioner, and communities were careful to choose individuals who demonstrated not just technical knowledge, but also sound judgment about when pharmaceutical interventions were appropriate and when they might cause more harm than good. The most advanced practitioners could customize their preparations for specific individuals and situations, taking into account factors like age, physical condition, work requirements, and even psychological temperament. This personalized approach to pharmaceutical enhancement was remarkably sophisticated for its time and contributed significantly to the effectiveness of rural survival strategies. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of rural Chinese pharmaceutical culture was its integration with what we might call community pharmacokinetics. Rather than treating pharmaceutical use as an individual decision, rural communities had developed elaborate protocols for coordinating drug use across entire populations to maximize collective effectiveness while minimizing individual risks. The coordination systems were complex and required extensive planning and communication. Communities would collectively prepare for seasonal challenges by synchronizing their pharmaceutical regimens, ensuring that everyone was using compatible substances that wouldn't create dangerous interactions or conflicting effects during group activities. The most sophisticated applications involved coordinating pharmaceutical support for large-scale community projects like dam construction, road building, or emergency responses to natural disasters. These projects required hundreds of people to work together with enhanced physical and mental capabilities, and rural communities had developed pharmaceutical protocols that could support such collective efforts safely and effectively. The planning required for these coordinated pharmaceutical interventions was extensive and detailed. Community leaders would need to consider factors like work schedules, individual health conditions, resource availability, and potential weather or social disruptions that could affect the project timeline or pharmaceutical effectiveness. The execution required remarkable discipline and coordination. Participants would need to follow precise timing schedules for substance administration, maintain communication about their physical and mental condition throughout the project, and be prepared to adjust their pharmaceutical regimens based on changing circumstances or unexpected challenges. The results were often spectacular. Historical records describe rural communities completing massive construction projects in impossibly short timeframes, responding to natural disasters with superhuman efficiency, and maintaining productivity during extended periods of extreme weather or social disruption that should have been devastating. These achievements weren't just the result of pharmaceutical enhancement, but the combination of chemical support with sophisticated organizational systems and collective determination that characterized Chinese rural communities at their best. The pharmaceutical knowledge was just one component of a comprehensive approach to community survival and prosperity. The most advanced rural pharmaceutical systems had developed what amounted to early forms of precision medicine, where practitioners could predict how specific individuals would respond to different substances and customize their recommendations accordingly. This personalized approach was based on centuries of accumulated observation about how various constitutional types responded to different pharmaceutical interventions. The diagnostic systems they used were remarkably sophisticated. Rural practitioners could assess an individual's pharmaceutical needs by examining everything from pulse patterns and tongue appearance to work habits and social relationships. This holistic approach allowed them to recommend pharmaceutical regimens that address not just immediate symptoms, but underlying constitutional imbalances that could lead to future health problems. The treatment protocols often extended over months or years, with practitioners adjusting pharmaceutical recommendations based on seasonal changes, life transitions, and evolving health conditions. This long-term approach to pharmaceutical intervention was remarkably advanced for its time and contributed significantly to the overall health and longevity of rural Chinese populations. The most remarkable success stories involved individuals who had been transformed from chronic invalids into productive community members through carefully managed long-term pharmaceutical interventions. These cases demonstrated the potential for pharmaceutical medicine to address not just acute health problems, but fundamental constitutional weaknesses that would otherwise have prevented people from participating fully in community life. But the real genius of rural Chinese pharmaceutical culture lay in their understanding of what modern medicine calls pharmaceutical ecology. They recognized that the effectiveness of any pharmaceutical intervention depended not just on the substances themselves, but on the entire environmental and social context in which they were used. This ecological approach led to sophisticated strategies for optimizing pharmaceutical effectiveness through lifestyle modifications, dietary changes, social support systems, and environmental adjustments that could enhance the therapeutic effects of their preparations, while minimizing potential risks or side effects. The environmental factors they considered included everything from seasonal weather patterns and local soil conditions to housing quality and work environments. They understood that pharmaceutical interventions would be more effective in some settings than others, and developed strategies for creating optimal conditions for therapeutic success. The social factors were equally important. Rural communities recognized that pharmaceutical treatment outcomes were significantly influenced by family relationships, community support, and social expectations. They developed elaborate protocols for providing psychological and social support that could enhance the effectiveness of their pharmaceutical interventions. The most advanced practitioners could orchestrate comprehensive treatment programs that addressed physical, psychological, social, and environmental factors simultaneously. These holistic interventions often produced results that seemed miraculous to outside observers, but were actually the predictable outcome of sophisticated understanding about how multiple therapeutic approaches could work together synergistically. This comprehensive approach to pharmaceutical intervention became one of the defining characteristics of Chinese medical culture and contributed significantly to China's reputation for medical sophistication that persisted well into the modern era. The knowledge and practices developed in rural communities provided the foundation for more formal medical systems that would later emerge in urban centers and imperial institutions. The preservation of this rural pharmaceutical knowledge became a crucial factor in Chinese civilization's ability to maintain cultural continuity, despite centuries of political upheaval and social change. Even when formal medical institutions collapsed or were destroyed, the pharmaceutical knowledge maintained in rural communities continued to provide essential healthcare services that helped Chinese society survive and recover from periodic disasters. The transmission systems they developed were remarkably resilient and adaptive. Knowledge could be passed down through family lineages, preserved in community traditions, or maintained through professional networks that operated independently of formal political or educational institutions. This redundancy ensured that valuable pharmaceutical knowledge rarely disappeared completely, even during the most chaotic periods of Chinese history. But the most impressive achievement of rural Chinese pharmaceutical culture was its contribution to what we might call demographic resilience, the health and vitality provided by sophisticated pharmaceutical interventions allowed Chinese rural populations to maintain high birth rates and low mortality rates that supported steady population growth over centuries. This demographic advantage became one of the foundations of Chinese political and economic power, providing the human resources necessary for large-scale agricultural development, military campaigns, and cultural achievements that distinguished Chinese civilization from its neighbors and rivals. The pharmaceutical knowledge that made this demographic success possible represented one of the most significant technological achievements of pre-modern civilization, demonstrating that sophisticated healthcare systems could be developed and maintained even without modern scientific understanding or industrial infrastructure. The lessons learned from Chinese rural pharmaceutical culture continue to be relevant today as modern societies struggle to develop sustainable healthcare systems that can provide effective treatment for entire populations rather than just wealthy elites. The Chinese example demonstrates that sophisticated pharmaceutical intervention can be achieved through community-based systems that emphasize prevention, personalization, and ecological awareness rather than just high-tech medical facilities and expensive treatments. Their most dangerous experiment, however, wasn't taking place in rural villages or imperial laboratories. It was happening in the bustling commercial centers where entrepreneurial physicians had discovered that the most profitable medicines weren't the ones that cured people quickly, but the ones that kept them coming back for more. You walk into a prosperous medical clinic in Song Dynasty Kaifeng around 1050 CE and immediately notice something unsettling about the patients in the waiting area. They're too calm, too content, sitting with the glazed expression of people who found something they can't live without and don't particularly want to. The physician who greets you has the smooth confidence of someone who's never worried about repeat business because his customers always return, usually within days of their last visit. This was the birth of what modern addiction specialists would recognize as medically supervised dependency. Except the supervisors were also the dealers, and the entire system was designed to maximize profit rather than promote health. Chinese commercial medicine had discovered the golden rule of pharmaceutical business. Chronic customers are more valuable than cured ones. The substances they used weren't particularly exotic or difficult to obtain. Opium poppies grew wild throughout much of China and could be easily cultivated in small plots that wouldn't attract official attention. Processing the raw opium into medicinal preparations required some skill, but nothing that couldn't be learned through brief apprenticeships with established practitioners. But the real innovation wasn't in the substances themselves. It was in the delivery systems and dosing protocols that commercial physicians had developed to maximize addiction potential while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical treatment. They had figured out how to create pharmaceutical preparations that provided genuine therapeutic benefits, initially, but gradually shifted the patient's neurochemistry in ways that made continued use feel necessary for normal functioning. The progression was subtle and carefully managed. New patients would receive preparations that effectively treated their original complaints while providing mild euphoric effects that made the treatment experience pleasant and memorable. Follow-up visits would involve slightly stronger formulations that provided better symptom relief, but also began to create physical dependence on the active compounds. Within a few weeks, patients would find themselves experiencing uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms if they missed their regular appointments. The physicians would helpfully explain that this was evidence of underlying constitutional weakness that required ongoing pharmaceutical support. The patients, desperate to avoid the anxiety, insomnia, and physical discomfort of withdrawal, would eagerly accept this explanation and commit to long-term treatment programs. The business model was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than charging high fees for infrequent visits, these commercial physicians could generate steady income streams from patients who needed regular appointments to maintain their pharmaceutical regimens. The patients became walking advertisements for the effectiveness of the treatments, since they genuinely felt better when properly medicated and obviously suffered when their medicine was unavailable. The social acceptance was remarkable. Chinese society had developed such sophisticated appreciation for pharmaceutical intervention that addiction was often interpreted as evidence of particularly advanced medical treatment, rather than a problem requiring intervention. Wealthy families would boast about their access to physicians who could provide medicines so effective that patients couldn't imagine living without them. The quality control was actually quite good, since commercial physicians understood that their long-term success depended on keeping their customers alive and functional. They developed precise dosing protocols that could maintain addiction without causing obvious health problems or social dysfunction that might attract unwanted attention from authorities or family members. The most successful practitioners specialized in treating what they called diseases of prosperity. These were conditions that primarily affected wealthy individuals who had enough leisure time to focus on minor physical discomforts and emotional dissatisfactions that wouldn't have received attention in poorer communities, where people were too busy surviving to worry about subtle mood disorders or chronic fatigue. The diagnostic processes were elaborate and convincing. Patients would undergo comprehensive examinations that identified multiple subtle imbalances and constitutional weaknesses that supposedly required ongoing pharmaceutical management. The practitioners had developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks that could explain why any symptom or complaint indicated serious underlying conditions that would worsen without proper treatment. The treatment protocols were personalized and constantly evolving. Practitioners would regularly adjust their formulations based on patient response, seasonal changes, and life circumstances, creating the impression of highly sophisticated medical care while actually fine-tuning the addiction maintenance systems to maximize patient dependency and treatment compliance. The most disturbing aspect was how these commercial addiction systems had become integrated with Chinese social and economic life. Wealthy families would often maintain long-term relationships with pharmaceutical physicians who provided ongoing medical support for multiple family members across several generations. These relationships became important social connections that could provide access to other services and opportunities. The physicians themselves often became influential community figures who could leverage their pharmaceutical knowledge into political influence and business opportunities. Some accumulated enough wealth to establish medical dynasties that controlled pharmaceutical trade in entire regions and could influence government policies related to drug regulation and medical practice. The regulatory environment was minimal and often corrupt. Chinese authorities were reluctant to interfere with medical practices that appeared to be helping wealthy citizens maintain their health and productivity. The tax revenues generated by pharmaceutical commerce provided significant income for local governments, creating incentives to ignore or minimize evidence of widespread addiction problems. The few attempts at regulation were usually ineffective because they focused on controlling specific substances rather than addressing the underlying business models that made medical addiction profitable. Practitioners would simply switch to different formulations that weren't covered by existing regulations, while maintaining the same dependency-creating treatment approaches. The social costs were significant, but often hidden. Families would spend enormous amounts of money maintaining pharmaceutical regimens for multiple numbers, sometimes impoverishing themselves to pay for medicines that provided no real therapeutic benefits beyond addiction maintenance. The economic impact on Chinese society was substantial, with vast resources diverted from productive activities into pharmaceutical dependency systems. The human costs were even more troubling. Entire generations grew up understanding pharmaceutical dependence as normal and even desirable, creating cultural attitudes that made it difficult to recognize or address addiction problems when they became obvious. The normalization of medical addiction created social environments where pharmaceutical abuse was tolerated or even encouraged. The most tragic cases involved children who were introduced to addictive medicines at early ages for minor health complaints and then maintained on pharmaceutical regimens throughout their development. These individuals often reached adulthood without ever experiencing normal neurochemistry and had no understanding of how to function without chemical support. The intergenerational effects were profound and lasting. Families with histories of pharmaceutical dependence often developed cultural traditions around medicine use that perpetuated addiction patterns across multiple generations. The knowledge required to break these patterns was rarely available, and social pressure to maintain family medical traditions often prevented individuals from seeking help. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how these commercial addiction systems had begun to influence legitimate medical practice throughout Chinese society. The financial success of dependency-based treatment models created pressure on honest physicians to adopt similar approaches or risk losing patients to competitors who could provide more immediately satisfying therapeutic experiences. The corruption of medical education was particularly troubling. Students training with commercially successful physicians would learn addiction maintenance techniques alongside legitimate therapeutic approaches, often without understanding the distinction between treatments designed to cure patients and those designed to create long-term customers. The research and development efforts focused increasingly on creating substances that could provide better addiction maintenance rather than more effective cures. Chinese pharmaceutical innovation began to prioritize patient satisfaction and treatment compliance over actual therapeutic outcomes, leading to a gradual degradation in the overall quality of medical care. The long-term consequences for Chinese medical culture were significant and lasting. The commercialization of addiction had created professional incentives that discouraged the development of truly curative treatments while rewarding practitioners who could create and maintain pharmaceutical dependencies. This fundamental corruption of medical priorities would have effects that persisted for centuries. The international reputation of Chinese medicine was also affected. Foreign observers began to notice the high rates of pharmaceutical dependence among Chinese populations and started to question whether Chinese medical practices were actually superior to alternatives available in other cultures. This skepticism would eventually contribute to the decline of Chinese medical influence in international contexts. The most ironic consequence was that the commercial success of addiction-based medicine actually undermined the legitimate achievements of Chinese pharmaceutical research. The association between Chinese medicine and drug dependency made it difficult for outside observers to appreciate the genuine innovations and therapeutic advances the Chinese practitioners had developed through centuries of careful experimentation and observation. This legacy of commercialized pharmaceutical addiction became one of the darkest chapters in Chinese medical history, demonstrating how even the most sophisticated medical knowledge could be corrupted by economic incentives that prioritized profit over patient welfare. The lessons learned from this experience remain relevant today as modern healthcare systems struggle with similar conflicts between commercial interests and genuine therapeutic goals. The recovery from this period required fundamental changes in how Chinese society understood the relationship between medicine and commerce, changes that would take generations to implement and would never completely eliminate the cultural legacy of medically supervised addiction that had become embedded in Chinese approaches to healthcare and pharmaceutical intervention. But the strangest chapter wasn't written in commercial clinics or rural villages. It was carved into the secret laboratories where Chinese alchemists had convinced themselves they could cheat death itself, one toxic pill at a time. You descend into a hidden chamber beneath a Taoist monastery, where the air shimmers with metallic vapors, and the walls are lined with furnaces that have been burning continuously for months. The master alchemist who greets you has the pale, trembling hands of someone who's been testing his own products for decades, and his eyes hold the peculiar intensity of a person who's absolutely convinced he's on the verge of discovering something that will change the fundamental nature of human existence. This wasn't casual experimentation or profit-driven medicine. This was systematic research into what Chinese alchemists called the great work, the ultimate pharmaceutical achievement that would grant not just health or enhanced performance, but actual immortality. The scale of resources devoted to these projects was staggering, with emperors and wealthy patrons funding elaborate research programs that consumed vast amounts of rare materials and human effort over centuries. The theoretical framework was sophisticated and internally consistent, even if it was based on assumptions that modern chemistry would find laughable. Chinese alchemists believed that the physical world was composed of opposing principles that could be balanced and refined through chemical processes to create increasingly perfect substances. The ultimate goal was to produce what they called the elixir of life, a substance so perfectly balanced and refined that it could transform mortal flesh into something imperishable. The research methodology was surprisingly rigorous, involving systematic experimentation with different combinations of materials, processing techniques, and timing protocols. Alchemical laboratories maintained detailed records of their experiments, tracking not just the immediate results, but long-term effects on test subjects and the stability of their preparations over extended periods. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. The test subjects for immortality research weren't just condemned criminals or desperate volunteers. Chinese alchemists had developed elaborate protocols for testing their preparations on themselves, convinced that only practitioners who truly understood the theoretical principles could safely navigate the dangerous territory between mortality and transcendence. The self-experimentation was methodical and carefully documented. Master alchemists would begin with tiny doses of their preparations, gradually increasing the quantities while carefully monitoring their physical and mental responses. They developed elaborate diagnostic techniques for assessing the progress of their transformation, looking for signs that their bodies were beginning to transcend normal biological limitations. The results were predictably disastrous, but interpreted through theoretical frameworks that could explain any outcome as evidence of progress toward the ultimate goal. Physical deterioration was understood as the necessary breakdown of mortal flesh that would eventually be replaced by immortal substance. Mental confusion was interpreted as the expansion of consciousness beyond normal human limitations. Even death was sometimes explained as successful transition to a higher state of existence. The most dedicated practitioners would consume increasingly toxic preparations over periods of years or decades, convinced that each dose was bringing them closer to immortality, even as their bodies showed obvious signs of heavy metal poisoning and organ failure. The psychological effects of chronic mercury and arsenic consumption created states of mind that reinforced their belief in the effectiveness of their treatments. The social dynamics around immortality research were complex and disturbing. Alchemical masters would attract disciples who were willing to serve as test subjects in exchange for the possibility of eventually achieving immortality themselves. These communities developed elaborate hierarchies based on who had progressed furthest in their transformation, with the most poisoned individuals often holding the highest status. The funding for these research programs came from patrons who were convinced that immortality was achievable and wanted to secure access to the elixir when it was finally perfected. Wealthy individuals would invest enormous sums in alchemical research, often bankrupting their families in pursuit of substances that promised eternal life, but delivered only expensive death. The most ambitious projects involved attempts to create immortality elixirs that could be mass-produced and distributed to entire populations. These programs required industrial-scale processing of toxic materials and created environmental contamination that affected entire regions. The pursuit of immortality had become a public health disaster that nobody was willing to acknowledge or address. The quality control for immortality research was simultaneously rigorous and completely insane. Alchemists would spend months or years perfecting their preparation techniques, testing different heating cycles and purification methods to create what they believed were increasingly perfect formulations. The irony was that their improved techniques often made their preparations more toxic rather than less, concentrating the dangerous compounds while eliminating potentially protective impurities. The most sophisticated laboratories had developed what amounted to early forms of industrial chemistry, with complex apparatus for distillation, sublimation, and chemical synthesis that wouldn't have looked out of place in a modern research facility. The technical skills required to operate this equipment were considerable, and master alchemists often spent decades mastering the practical aspects of their craft. But the theoretical understanding that guided their work was fundamentally flawed in ways that made their technical sophistication tragically counterproductive. The more skillfully they could process their toxic materials, the more efficiently they could poison themselves while believing they were achieving spiritual transformation. The documentation from these immortality research programs provides a fascinating glimpse into how intelligent, educated people could systematically deceive themselves about the results of their experiments. The alchemical texts contain detailed descriptions of preparation methods, theoretical explanations for various phenomena, and case studies of practitioners who had supposedly achieved various stages of immortal transformation. Reading these documents today is like examining the laboratory notebooks of extremely sophisticated researchers who were conducting rigorous experiments based on completely incorrect hypotheses about the fundamental nature of reality. The methodology was sound, but the underlying assumptions guaranteed that the results would be misinterpreted in ways that led to continued self-destruction. The most disturbing aspect was how the research programs adapted to maintain their credibility despite mounting evidence that their approaches were fatally flawed. When practitioners died from their experimental treatments, the deaths would be reinterpreted as successful transitions to higher states of existence. When preparations failed to produce the expected effects, the failures would be attributed to impurities in the materials or errors in the timing, rather than fundamental problems with the theoretical framework. This ability to rationalize failure and reinterpret negative results as positive outcomes allowed the immortality research programs to continue for centuries, consuming vast resources and destroying countless lives, while never producing any genuine progress toward their stated goals. The psychological mechanisms that supported these delusions were remarkably sophisticated and resistant to contradictory evidence. The international influence of Chinese immortality research was significant and troubling. Foreign visitors would observe the elaborate alchemical laboratories and sophisticated preparation techniques without understanding the self-destructive nature of the underlying research program. Some returned to their own countries with Chinese alchemical knowledge that they attempted to replicate, spreading the dangerous practices beyond China's borders. The most tragic consequence was that the resources devoted to immortality research represented an enormous opportunity cost for Chinese civilization. The brilliant minds, vast wealth, and sophisticated technical capabilities that were consumed by these ultimately futile projects could have been directed toward research programs that would have produced genuine benefits for Chinese society. The decline of the immortality research programs eventually came not through scientific enlightenment, but through practical considerations. The obvious failure of the treatments to produce the promised results, combined with the mounting costs and social disruption caused by widespread heavy metal poisoning, gradually reduced support for alchemical research among rational patrons and government officials. But the legacy of immortality research had lasting effects on Chinese culture and medical practice. The association between sophisticated pharmaceutical preparation and dangerous experimentation created skepticism about advanced medical treatments that may have prevented Chinese medicine from developing in more productive directions. The cultural memory of alchemical disasters contributed to conservative attitudes about medical innovation that persisted for generations. The most important lesson from Chinese immortality research may be how easily sophisticated technical knowledge can be combined with flawed theoretical understanding to create systems that are simultaneously impressive and completely destructive. The alchemical laboratories represented some of the most advanced chemical research facilities of their time, but their fundamental mission guaranteed that their technical achievements would be used in ways that caused harm rather than benefit. This pattern of sophisticated means being applied to impossible ends became a recurring theme in Chinese intellectual history, demonstrating how cultural and philosophical assumptions could channel remarkable human capabilities into ultimately futile or destructive directions. The immortality research programs stand as a warning about the dangers of pursuing goals that are attractive in theory, but impossible in practice. The final irony was that Chinese alchemists, in their pursuit of substances that could grant eternal life, had actually developed some of the most effective methods for shortening human lifespan that had ever been discovered. Their technical mastery of chemical processing allowed them to create preparations that could deliver toxic compounds to the human body with an efficiency that would have been impossible using cruder methods. In their quest to transcend human limitations, they had instead created new and more effective ways to destroy human health and vitality. The great work of immortality had become, in practice, a sophisticated system for accelerating death while maintaining the illusion of spiritual progress and scientific advancement. But as we near the end of our journey through ancient China's pharmaceutical wonderland, there's one final